Hi, this is Frode, and welcome to the first episode of Actualized Notes TV. As many of you might know, I have been switching channels from 5 Big Ideas to Frode Osen, which is my own name. And that's because I'm not just about ideas, I'm about helping you actualize your potential. And I figured out that a new logo would come good with that. So I got a triangle, or a pyramid, which symbolizes Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where self-actualization is at the very top. And actualize for me means that you pursue growth. You have a grit, which is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals, and you live with arete, at your highest potential, moment to moment. So, that was a quick announcement, and today we have another great book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Powerful lessons in personal change. I can remember first hearing an audiobook of this book while I was in high school. And I can vividly remember riding my bike to school and listening to the inspiring stories and principles that Stephen shared in his book. Although I won't go into all of the habits in themselves, I will give you an overview of them here. First one, be proactive. The second, begin with the end in mind. Third, put first things first. 4, think win-win. 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. 6, synergize. And 7, sharpen the saw. A habit we will go into in idea number 4. And Stephen Covey was an internationally recognized leadership authority, family expert, teacher, organizational consultant, and author, who dedicated his life to principle-centered living and leadership to build both families and organizations. This book alone has sold over 20 million copies in 38 languages over the whole world. So if you're into some powerful lessons in personal change, I think you'll love this book. Now let's get a small overview of the 5 big ideas. Inside out. Inside out means that you start looking at problems from yourself. You see how you can contribute to problems. Stimulus response. Between stimulus and response is a gap. And what gap? Well, we'll figure out. Third, the circle of influence. We have a circle of concern, things we can't control, and a circle of influence, things we can control. Which one do we want to focus on? And fourth, sharpen the saw. And sharpening the saw is what makes all other habits possible. It's renewing the 4 dimensions of your being. And fifth, crescendo. Crescendo is a musical term, which means play music with greater intensity, with strength and striving. And we'll go more into that in the 5th big idea. But first, let's go into the 1st big idea. Inside out. Inside out means to start with the most inner part of yourself, with your paradigms, your character, and your motives. So instead of trying to look at problems from outside in, like everything else is wrong, your circumstances, the other people, and things that happen to you, you start looking at problems from how you are contributing to those problems. And you see how you can help solve those problems. If you want to have a good relationship, then you need to be the kind of person who exudes positive energy and sidesteps negative energy when bad things happen. If you want to have more freedom in your job, then you need to be more responsible, helpful, and contributing to your company. Jim Rohn echoes this wisdom with a great quote. If you want things to change, you have to change. If you want things to be better, you have to be better. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have the perspective of outside in. And going at problems from the outside in means that you see yourself as a victim. You constantly blame and complain about your own misfortunes. You blame other people and circumstances. And Brian Johnson talks about the same idea in his book A Philosopher's Notes, where he says that if you're criticizing, complaining, blaming, comparing, and gossiping, you can be pretty sure you're hanging out in victim land, the unhappiest place on earth. So, Have there been any problems that you have been blaming other people for lately, or circumstances? And can you see how you yourself can contribute to solving those problems? The second big idea is stimulus response. Viktor Frankl was a man who was imprisoned in the death camps of Nazi Germany, and he suffered torture and innumerable dignities, just like many of the other prisoners there. And what he found out was that the Nazi captors could do whatever they wanted with his body, and they could control his whole environment. But one thing they could never take away from him, and that was his freedom, the last of the human freedoms, his ability to choose how he would respond. And this is really the place between stimulus and response. You have something that happens to you, and you react to it. But between that is a gap. And that's your ability to choose an empowered response. Abraham Maslow talks about the same idea in Toward a Psychology of Being. And he says that the notion that we are completely set in motion by external stimuli, that we just react impulsively to things that happen to us, becomes ridiculous for the self-actualizer. And since actualize is what we are all about, let's step between that stimulus and response and choose how we will respond in an empowered way. The third big idea is the circle of influence. So Stephen talks about that we all have a circle of concern, which are all the things that we can't control: the national economy, time, and the weather. And we also have a circle of influence, which are all of the things that we can control. Whether we put on our jacket when it rains, whether we save money to be safe during hard economic times, and whether we give ourselves enough time to do what's most important to us. He says that the proactive person gives more of his focus and energy on the things that he can control, the circle of influence, while the reactive person gives more of his focus and energy on the things he can't control. He constantly blames other people for his own misfortunes, and he blames other circumstances, the bad things that happen to him. You can imagine what happens to the circle of influence as you focus on the things you can't control. It diminishes. And maybe you can see how this relates to victimland that Brian Johnson talks about. It looks like a pretty unhappy place to be, right? So, if you want to have more energy in your life, you need to focus more on the things that you can't control. Because when you give more of your focus on the things you can't control, you empower those things to control you. So what's one thing you have been giving much of your focus on? For example, watching too much news, complaining about the weather, or not saving up any money to be safe during hard economic times. And how can you turn that into something that you can control? Or focus more on what you can control? The fourth big idea is to sharpen the saw. Imagine that you come upon a man in the woods who is sawing down a tree. What are you doing, you say? Can't you see? The impatient response comes back. I'm sawing down a tree. And you look exhausted, you say. How long have you been at it? For 5 hours, he says, exhausted. And this is really tiring. This is hard work. Well, why don't you just take a few minutes to sharpen the saw, you say. I don't have time for that, he says emphatically. I'm too busy sawing. And habit number 7 is to sharpen the saw, to renew the 4 dimensions of your being, to make all of the other habits in your life possible. And the 4 dimensions are your physical, spiritual, mental, and social/emotional. In some ways that you can improve ensure that you sharpen the saw physically is to eat right, move more, and sleep better. And Eat, Move, Sleep is a great book that I have just read that I will be covering in the future. To renew your spiritual dimension, you can study, meditate, or journal. To renew your mental dimension, you can read, write, and plan for the future. And for the social and emotional dimension, you can spend more time serving other people, showing them empathy, and spending more time with those people that you care most about. So what are some ways that you can sharpen the saw, other than those that I mentioned? The fifth big idea is crescendo. Crescendo is a musical term. It means to play music with ever greater intensity and volume, with strength and striving. It means that, and the opposite is diminuendo. Which means to lower the volume, to back off, to play it safe, to get passive and to whimper away your life. And Stephen says that living life in crescendo means that the most important work you will ever do is always ahead of you. It is never behind you. And he also says that we need to stop looking in the rear view mirror of all that we have done, and instead look forward with optimism. You have important contributions to make. You need to go out and make those contributions. So how have you been thinking that the most important work you will ever have done is behind you? Well, think again, and go out and do your work. Well, that was crescendo. Live your life in crescendo. The most important work you will ever do is always ahead of you, never behind you. Sharpen the saw. We need to renew our physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, social dimensions of our being, to make sure that we can be able to satisfy all other habits too. Circle of influence. We need to give more focus on a circle of influence, those things we can't control, and less focus on the circle of concern, things we can't control. Stimulus response. As Viktor Frankl in the death camps showed us, between stimulus, something that happens, and response, our reaction to it, is our ability to choose how we are going to respond. We can take a deep breath and choose wisely. Inside out versus outside in thinking. We want to see problems from the perspective that we might have been contributing to those problems, instead of just complaining and criticizing all other people and circumstances. So that was it for today. This is Frode Osen with Actualize. Make sure you focus on growth, grit, and arte. Thank you very much for watching. Have an awesome day. See ya.